Guess what, theology nerds? I have a question for you.
Yeah? What's that question?
Can capitalism be ethical at all?
That's a good question.
Jesus wants to know, and we're going to talk about it today on the podcast. Boom. That's right. Hello, everybody. My name is Tripp. This is the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, and you know what? We like to bring you ingredients. That's right, in the audio format so that you can brew your own faith. No, I don't want to think for you. I want to think with you. And today, Brent Waters is on the podcast.
He's going to think with you today.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And here we are, Nathan, just recording a podcast intro. What do you think about that?
I mean, what else are you going to do?
Well,
this is a perfect day for recording podcast intros, so.
It is. Brent is a professor at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, and we're talking about his book, Just Capitalism, A Christian Ethic of Economic Globalization.
I have a feeling some people are going to have some very strong responses.
Strong responses?
To this.
I'm eagerly anticipating watching Gregory Stevens' tweets.
That's exactly who I had in mind.
If anyone wants to go to @HelloGregory on Twitter, at some point when he listens to this, his running commentary will be
I hope he live tweets listening to this episode.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, before we jump into the interview and you'll talk about the economy and ethics and all that kind of stuff, I just want to tell you two things today. Two things. One, this is the beginning of the 9th year of the podcast.
That's a lot of years.
Or is it the beginning of the 10th?
Well, I don't know when you began, so.
In 2008.
Okay. Yeah.
So you just finished. So it's the start of the 10th year or something. And then you turn 10 at the end of it, right?
I think that's how math works.
Anyway, next year we turn 10, and that's exciting. And on top of that, so far this year, every month we've had more and more new listeners to the podcast.
So thank you, new listeners.
So thank you, new listeners. There's like 1,000 other episodes for you to catch up on when
when you have nothing else to do.
Yeah. So thank you. The exciting thing is, when I started the podcast a long time ago, I was applying for PhD programs, and I just turned in my dissertation. So,
I really wish I had a fanfare button to push. And stuff would happen.
We could just use these. Use these.
What?
Yeah, there we go.
That was effective.
Well, we got these buttons. When do you get to use effects when you're recording podcast intros?
When you turn in your PhD dissertation.
Yeah, well, so, if you never hear about this again, then the defense did not go well. So don't bring it up. If it does go well, I anticipate.
You can buy a copy of the book soon. No.
Yeah, I've been, I joked about it, and then now I'm really considering setting up pay whatever you want. Just in hopes that someone else reads it, because you work a long time.
So if you want to read Tripp Fuller's dissertation, just tweet at Tripp Fuller.
Yeah, and the other thing I thought was set it up where whatever you goes into Elgin's college fund, because I have like $100,000 of student loans, so I'm never going to pay mine off. So they're kind of the kids are just going to have to.
He's in the hole.
They're going to have to study or really volunteer for the right political campaigns. It's like start making videos, forgive student loans. Well,
yeah, maybe he'll become a famous YouTube star.
Oh, yeah, that would be awesome.
I mean, you had a crack at it with the
Bibliotheca
giveaway reveal video.
Oh yeah,
which by the way, if you don't know, you should go enter to win, because we're giving away 2
copies,
complete sets.
Yeah.
Of the new Bibliotheca.
Which is like one of the biggest Kickstarter campaigns of all time when they started. And it's a beautiful edition of the Bible.
An
artisanal
Bible.
Yeah. Like,
I don't know if they would say that, but
if it was a coffee bean, it would be roasted by a guy with a mustache.
You pay $8 for this cup of coffee is what we're saying.
And like the translation, the layout, and everything is built to be a piece of literature.
Yeah.
So if you've ever thought, what would it be like to read the Bible as a piece of literature
without like verse numbers?
None of that.
Not chapter headings.
I started at Genesis.
It's weird,
and
isn't it?
It's straight up weird.
Yeah.
But I will say that if you're reading the Bible as literature and none of the other stuff's there, and you can't like go to the footnotes to like see what nerds argue about and things, you ask really different questions.
Totally.
And it's really pretty.
Yeah.
Like,
it is. It just looks amazing.
No, I meant like Genesis. It's translated and made to like be as close to literal as it can be while being aesthetically appealing.
Yeah.
And I didn't get distracted by the things I would normally get distracted about.
Right. It
is. And as someone who reads the Bible a lot, and I almost always use one of two Bibles.
Yeah.
Like,
are you going to put this one in your rotation now?
I have my big black Oxford annotated Bible. At home, I have the New Revised Standard, the HarperCollins one.
Yeah.
Because they have different editing teams. And then if I'm going to read Hebrew Bible stuff, I like the Jewish Study Bible with all the rabbis talking it, because rabbis just love arguing. They got great material.
Yeah.
And for children's Bibles, I like the Spark Bible. That it's pretty good.
And now you have a new one to throw in there.
Yeah.
Thanks to the guys at Bibliotheca.
I know. So
you can get in on it too.
Yep.
We're going to give one away to a community member.
Yep.
So if you're not a community member, you should become one.
Yeah. What's a community member?
Oh, that's where you pay monthly to support the podcast and get all kinds of awesome benefits like ecclesiastical titles.
Oh yeah.
And all sorts of exclusive content and stuff, courses that we do, and things like epic reads and webinars and stuff like that nobody else gets access to.
Oh yeah. Did I tell you the list? So Barry Taylor and I are going to do a series of articles for epic reads together.
Mm-hmm.
Did I tell you about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we are narrowing the list down to like 3 different articles on the role of technology in shaping spirituality.
Sounds exciting.
Oh yeah, I'm excited.
So you should become a Homebrew community member.
Because they want to hang out with us on
See, here's the thing. We're giving away 2 copies, one to the general public, one to the community.
Yeah.
There's a lot less people in the community than there are
in the general public.
So you have a greater chance of winning if you become a community member.
So you can go to homebrewedcommunity.com if you want to join. That's what all the cool kids are doing these days.
Absolutely.
That's the rumor on the street.
That's what I heard.
And the other thing I was going to say is Pete's just about to get back from Ireland,
wherever he is,
and we're going to be have him back on to talk about Theology Beer Camp.
Yeah, you thought we forgot about that, but
what?
We didn't. Theology Beer Camp.
No, this summer Theology Beer Camp. If you have not got your ticket in Denver, you're going to want to get it because like I just saw the list of all the breweries that are bringing beer, and it's going to be off the Chizane. And
I know Charlie in Oklahoma City has been working it.
There's a secret about that.
Oh.
This is only if you're like a level 10 beer nerd. So Charlie has a friend who has a bottle collection that is like very significant. Like he has a whole building dedicated to his beer collection. And he had, his friend was like, why don't you just bring a couple boxes over here and get
nice.
Like, so he's got cases of bottles that are like $100 bottles of beer, all aged, perfectly stored.
Just to be clear, when you buy the ticket for Theology Beer Camp, what you're buying is not all, great content.
Yeah.
Obviously. Amazing experiences that you're never going to get ever again. But all this beer too. It's included in the price of the ticket. You don't have to pay extra for the beer. Just to be clear.
Oh, it is a ticket. The ticket is
you get so much for that.
Brought into it's the experience.
Yeah.
It includes like a food.
Yep.
And some delicious coffee.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And
probably karaoke singing with Pete and Tripp too.
Yeah. I don't know if y'all heard that Pete said that he is eagerly looking forward to karaoke. And at least from Twitter, where people suggested songs, it's either Disney duets or Striper covers. So I don't know.
You know what? Both and, Tripp.
Both and. So I'm thinking go on and kiss the girl from Little Mermaid, because I feel like Pete could do a good Sebastian.
Yeah.
Go on and kiss the girl.
Yeah.
And then if you're going to do Stripe, see, some people want to go like To Hell with the Devil or something that has like a big scream. But I'm thinking Together as One. A nice soft ballad written for a good, very pure Christian wedding.
Yeah. Sounds just like Pete. That's what I think of when I think of Pete.
Now is the time that we stand together as
There's nothing like a good 80s rock ballad, you know?
There are some things kind of like it. but just not exactly like it. So, yeah, we're really looking
So go
forward
to
to
theologybeercamp.com.
Duh. You should go to theologybeercamp.com and get your tickets. And if you're not in flyover country, and I know Denver people say they're not flyover country because for some reason they don't touch an ocean, and it's where you have layovers when you're going from coast to coast, but it's not flyover country because you lay over there.
Right.
Or whatever. Denver has the weirdest airport of all time. They have this like weird art that looks like a post-apocalyptic zombie stuff on the walls. I don't know if anyone.
So if you want to come see that, you should clearly go to Denver.
Yeah. In the airport is like not actually in the city. It's really odd.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But we're going to be there in Oklahoma City in August.
Yes.
This year.
Well, now I forgot what I was going to say.
There you go.
There was one other thing I was going to say.
You're welcome, listeners.
Well,
now we can get into the interview.
No, it's a great interview, and make sure you go check out Brent's book, Just Capitalism, because some people are going to love it. Some people are going to go like, "Oh my God, what's this about?" And other people are going to like, "He's too liberal, he's too conservative," and then like I'm going to guess like the one step to the left of center people are going to be like, "Isn't this common sense?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And everyone be on the lookout at Hello Gregory's Twitter responses to this are going to be great. Which if you're on Twitter, then let me know, because we have a Twitter list of homebrewed deacons. So at Tripp Fuller, and I'll put you on the list. And if you are a deacon, you should go check the list out because it's pretty entertaining.
Oh yeah.
Plus, with NBA playoffs going on, there's a group of us that take it very seriously on the list.
Way too seriously.
Well, you haven't even been here when the Lakers are in the playoffs.
No, I have not.
It really occupies a month and a half of my life. I just got to listen to all the podcasts about the Lakers between each game. And then I just pace back and forth.
Yeah. Like
it was a hospital waiting room.
And your new son
This entire season was a hospital waiting room. It was horrible. Well, friends.
Speaking of capitalism and professional sports.
This episode will, I don't know if we talk about basketball.
No, I was just trying to segue.
All right. Here it comes. Prepare yourself. Smoochy boochies. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast is Brent Waters. He is a UCC minister, a theological ethicist. He is a professor at Evangelical Theological, or Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. And on top of that, he's written a book that might just irritate more people in theological ethics than it has done in a long time. And he does so in an annoyingly persuasive way at multiple points. The book is called Just Capitalism, a Christian Ethic of Economic Globalization, and a thesis and argument that will irritate the left and the right alike. So thank you so much for joining us, Brett.
Oh, my pleasure.
So maybe you can talk about, before we jump in, like what was your own kind of self-understanding or story of faith that led you both to be a professional theologian, ordained minister, and kind of invest your time and energy in academic teaching and writing?
Well, I mean, initially I had a call to ministry and was a campus minister for a number of years at Iowa State University, and then went back to my alma mater as chaplain, University of Redlands. But increasingly felt an urge that I wanted to get to the classroom, so I became an elderly doctoral student after that, and over in Oxford, and then came back and I've been teaching theological ethics ever since. And the reason I like ethics is because it really, I think, forces you to address extraordinarily important questions to which there are no easy answers. Now, it's not as if I want to always stay lodged in ambiguity, but I don't like easy answers.
Mm-hmm. In a book like this, dealing with globalization and markets and this type of thing, what are the easy answers that you think are just too popular to really be adequate?
Well, I think the two easiest answers that I find most frustrating would be on one hand is saying that anything dealing with market exchange, anything dealing with money is by definition either at best tawdry or at worst evil. And I think that that's just simply not the case, because I think as Christians, we have to address the material well-being of people. It's just part of what it means to be a Christian. And markets are remarkably efficient at addressing material needs and wants. There are issues, however, about do markets operate fairly? How do we get people into markets? And those are all the issues that you need to deal with. I think the other easy solution that should be rejected is the notion that we're best off with something like protectionism by ensuring that trade doesn't happen, or if it does, it's very expensive. I think ultimately that hurts the poor, doesn't help them. So it's saying, look, it's a little more complex than that. You need trade. You need something like globalization if the poor have any realistic prospect of ever leaving dire impoverishment.
Mm-hmm. So when you're thinking to kind of approaching this issue as a Christian ethicist, how do you shape the conversation by just defining even what we mean by like a free markets and exchange and this type of thing before even getting to the story of globalization? I think one of the gifts of your book is clarity as to what you mean by words that tend to just be master signifiers of a side you're taking on an issue emotively rather than reflectively and critically.
Well, one of the things to do, I think, is to very early on emphasize how important exchange is, particularly in a modern society. You and I probably couldn't live very well. We certainly couldn't flourish if we didn't have exchange. And increasingly, the interesting thing is that economics itself, when you look at it, explodes the fiction of autonomy, how utterly dependent we are on one another to get things done and to get things we want. The question I always ask in my class when we get to the section on economics and globalization is, so you think you're autonomous? Well, how many of you this morning built the building that you're living in? How many of you made the clothes you're wearing right now? How many of you constructed the transportation you took? And after a while, they get the point that in order to live, they need one another. And I think economics really brings us across that exchange is necessary. And it's not to be something that is frowned upon by Christians necessarily. They have to say, okay, how do we shape this form of exchange so that particularly the poor are enabled? So the other question I raised with them about globalization is to say, look, to be for or against globalization is tantamount to being for or against icebergs. It's the wrong question. The question is, how do you navigate?
And when you think of globalization, can you describe kind of the elements of it both as economically, but also the concerns we may have culturally, and how globalization, I think, has been connected also to very disturbing missiologies of the church historically?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when I'm thinking, and specifically I was focusing on economic globalization, but I think the three major forces to keep in mind is that you need free-flowing capital so that capital can go in the world where it's most needed with very few restrictions, that you need free trade so that goods can be produced and exchanged in a comparative advantage for both parties, and third, you need relatively unrestricted labor flow. I mean, that's the interesting thing. Labor migration is very much a part of globalization because either people are going to go where the jobs are on offer or the jobs are going to go where the workforce is. And that's just, I think, the reality of that kind of world. That's what you need to learn how to navigate. Are there concerns with that? I think, yeah, there are. That globalization is probably not good news for the particularity of communities. Mm-hmm. Because, increasingly, wherever you go in the world, you see the same products. Airports are pretty much the same. Increasingly, cultures are beginning to lose their distinctiveness. And I think that's a real challenge. And how can you make that, if at all, compatible with globalization? I mean, it may be one of the trade-offs that you make. I don't know. I mean, I think we're in new waters at this point, and we're not quite sure how to navigate it. Mm-hmm. In terms of, I think it also lends itself, you're right, to a lot of bad missiologies, but I think potentially it lends itself to a good missiology from the standpoint that historically the mission of the church has never been territorial. That in some sense, globalization opens up possibilities for the church to be a better church because it realizes that its identity is not tied to things like shared ethnicity, shared nationality, shared territory, but what binds Christians together is wherever two or three are gathered. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really matter where in the world you're gathered.
So, when you're thinking of the kind of the free market's ability to move capital in the right place and stuff, like move it to the right place assumes some type of evaluation, like ethical thinking. And I think a lot of the kind of critics of markets have to do with the assumptions that more freedom equals it goes to the right place, when there was no equal starting point at any point, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, they're right. It's not a level playing field, and to try to pretend that it would be or could be, I think, is a mistake. It's rather to help think through what prevents capital from being invested where it needs to be invested. And oftentimes it's local restrictions that make it almost impossible to make the kinds of capital investments that are needed. I mean, for example, in Hong Kong, it takes less than 3 days to set up a corporation, where in places like Chad, it takes over a year and a half because of all the steps that have to be taken and all the restrictions. So if you're going to make a foreign investment, you're probably going to make it in a place like Hong Kong rather than a place like Chad. So you have to really ask the question, how do you begin to enable more and more people to participate? Well, you have to have, I think, smart policies and smart regulations. And that's part of the challenge, is to say, I don't think anyone's going to argue that you should have an unregulated market.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what kinds of regulations do you need and who are they enabling? And all I'm arguing is that the more restrictions you have, it's probably bad news for the poor much more than it is for the rich, because they really don't have the options where the rich do.
Well, one of the things that I think comes up in the book is you make an argument that the new markets and expanding markets are best for human flourishing and the preferential option for the poor. And I think that like if you were to tweet that, people would probably go, like, what? Where'd that come from?
Yeah.
So can you describe kind of your own understanding of what human flourishing looks like and what it means as a Christian to recognize the preferential option for the poor?
Yeah, that's okay. That's a very simple question, but it's going to take a complex answer. So you're going to have to bear with me for a while on this one. And if I begin to wander too much, drag me back to the original question so I don't forget to answer it. The book itself is divided into two sections. And the first section is basically saying exchange is necessary. But the second part is saying, but not sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so where the exchange comes in is saying, look, people need to have their basic material wants and needs met. And if they don't, it is likely that they will never flourish. And I'll get to in a moment what I mean by flourishing. It's the notion that Scripture is quite correct. We do not live by bread alone. But we really don't know that until we have more than enough bread to eat. So, we got to get the bread on the table.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not enough, in a sense that once you begin to address the material wants and needs, and that's based on exchange, which is what yours becomes mine and mine becomes yours, where I think human flourishing takes place is in those settings of koinonia, which is the basis of the word for communication, community, communion. And their goods are not exchanged, but they're shared, so that what is yours and mine becomes ours. And I think that's where humans flourish. But they first of all have to address those material wants and needs of the market, which is exchange, in order to have then the basis of the koinonia, the opportunity to really engage in that flourishing. And I think the flourishing it's very almost impossible to assign a financial value to it. That's why it doesn't show up in GDP.
Mm-hmm.
But it's real and it's there. And I think that this is where people thrive is when they're in those what I would call communicative associations.
So can you describe how you understand the preferential option for the poor?
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any reason to object to traditional Catholic and Christian social teaching on that. Mm-hmm. I think clearly within Scripture there is a preferential option for the poor. But this is what taught me about when I started reading economics, which, by the way, much to my surprise, I actually found I enjoyed reading as long as there weren't too many numbers. But because basically economics is discourse on stewardship and human nature, mm-hmm. and how do we allocate things that have value to us. But on preferential option for the poor, I really tried to ask myself, and this is where the counterintuitive move comes in. If you really want to help exercise that option, the only realistic game in town right now are markets. Because so far every other system that's tried to address that problem, and in many cases has only made the plight of the poor worse because of the unintended consequences. It's really by enabling people to get in there and compete in markets that they begin to take responsibility for themselves, where they begin to have the opportunities to alleviate the poverty. Because again, it's maybe simplistic, but the best way to eliminate poverty is to have a job. So in the creation of these markets, you also create employment opportunities, you create entrepreneurial opportunities. And so I was saying, if you really want to exercise this option, enable the poor to participate more fully in these global markets.
And one of the things that you point out in the book is that even when dealing with the questions of poverty and impoverishment, you're not kind of saying, yeah, we'll deal with that with charity. You also talk about the role of charity, assistance, and exchange, and the church and even the society itself, and thinking about it, needs to consider not just meeting the needs so you can flourish, but what does the human being who flourishes do, and how do they gain what the basic needs?
Yeah, I think that was, for me, that was one of the more interesting parts of the book to do the research on, is how is charity and exchange related, and increasingly I think both are important, but they serve very different purposes. I think charity is now primarily an emergency response. When people are hungry, you feed them. When they're sick, you tend to them. But to keep people perpetually dependent upon the charity of others, I think, is not a good thing. I think it destroys the human spirit, in fact. So you really have to enable them and to participate in exchange where the relationship is reciprocal rather than one way, and that's the more longer term solution. So it's that's why you need both investment and you need kind of grants and things like this. But there again, what we tend to do is, rather than asking people in impoverished regions, what do you need, we tend to impose our agenda on them, and ultimately the help isn't there. I mean, an example of that is, I believe it's in Addis Ababa, that the hospital there has 4 state-of-the-art incubators because they have a problem of premature births. They've never been used. And it's because there's no reliable source of electricity, and the backup batteries aren't reliable enough. No one ever asked the question, do they have the electrical infrastructure to have these kinds of gifts, and what was it they really need? And again, it's really looking at how do you enable the local people to make the decisions that are best for them, because they know more about their situation than I do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things, like even that example, all the way to like looking at our military spending as a country, right, where we're building stuff that we're not even going to use and parking it out in the desert, while not even funding basic school construction in impoverished areas, or Los Angeles's prison system in connection to poverty and stuff like that. It seems to me that one of the arguments in the book that people that on the right and left can both, I guess, need a pause on, is realizing that like regulations and arguing to preserve people's rights, or redistributing things in different ways, function better at the more local or communal level. That in your own communities, the needs better, and yet we get these examples where these powers that at a higher scale end up perverting the possibilities at the local level, and I wonder how would you describe those at the global scale type of perversity of powers? I think one of the temptations for more progressive people will be like, yeah, they're multinational companies, military-industrial complex, blah 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 blah. Therefore, market's bad, and I think yours is more of it's not denying all of that, but it's also saying, this is what we really have to deal with. This is we don't have a whole lot of options here as what's available to do a bunch of these things. So let's figure out how to responsibly, critically, and faithfully engage the terms of the real world, or in a sense.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm neither a policy wonk nor the son of a policy wonk. But it seems to me that in the literature that I've read and tried to write in the book, was that the best policies are those that really ask the question, how do we empower the people who are going to be most directly affected? And that's going to have cultural variation around the globe of how you answer that question. So that imposing top-down solutions often produces more unintended consequences from good motivations that actually end up harming the people they're intended to help. Another simple example of that is that I forget which country in Africa, but one of the easiest treatments you can do to prevent malaria is simply provide sleeping nets. Well, a well-meaning NGO distributed free nets and ran 4 businesses locally out of business, creating greater impoverishment. So really what they should have thought through was, how do we invest in these companies to help them become even more productive, create more employment opportunities while providing something necessary like mosquito nets. So those are the kinds of things, the questions that I think we need to start asking is a different kind of question, of saying, here's the solution, is to begin to saying, can we identify the problem and then work with local people in developing the best possible solutions. That just takes, I think, a lot more work, and also it's quite frankly not, how can I put this? It's not sexy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who wants to build an electrical grid? Who wants to build a sewer system? And yet those is, one of the best things you could do in situations of dire poverty is provide reliable sources of energy so people quit cooking with wood and dung. Those are the kinds of things that I realize that in some ways, this is where markets are very good, because you have people out there who know how to identify what customers want. Mm-hmm. Much more, and I think they're much better at it than government often is.
So, how would you describe or you said that those closer to being affected are the ones we need to empower. I know that now there's been an argument in a lot of kind of small business startup stuff here in LA and in San Francisco, that in shifting even the way the corporation's structured so that there are more worker-owned companies, in part because, if the board of directors are made up of the people that drink from the water source next to where it's served, you're more likely to make better environmental decisions than if it's someone that the decision's made and they're an investor in a different state. And if the board are all employees of it, you're more likely to have closer pay scale, so that everyone's more likely to be getting a living wage as part of a successful business than relying on government subsidies for large numbers of your hourly employees and tax breaks that then drain public schools and stuff like that. I know a couple friends working on issues like that. How do you see reframing maybe some of the tools that are organizing principles in the markets already for more just local type of empowerment relations?
Right. Well, I think there's two things there. Is that locally owned small businesses, I think, are vital to a community's health, and they should be encouraged. But I think we actually now have perhaps unwittingly implemented policies which make that less likely than more likely. What I mean by that is that increasingly it's very difficult for people to get small business loans. And that's partly because of changed regulations of ensuring that banks that are too big to fail will be the banks that get most of the business. And it's really small local banks that have really driven small business in the past. They simply don't have the money to loan, or they don't want to take the risk. So that what's really declining in the United States right now are new startups, dramatically declining. And that's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And you have to rethink the policies. What can we do to encourage people to take the risk to create these kinds of business enterprises that you were talking about, that are owned by workers, that are not necessarily corporations and partnerships, really. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where you really need, again, to look at the policies to say, what are you encouraging? What are you discouraging? And are you willing to change after you've seen the unintended consequences? But we have a tendency to get policy in place and then we don't want to change it. Well, maybe it's time to revisit that and say, well, is this really what you want to accomplish with these kind of policies? But I think it's going to be difficult, because increasingly one of the things of globalization is that these small businesses will be competing with very large competitors, and corporations are different beasts than local businesses, because particularly in global corporations and with capitalism, the population is going to become increasingly nomadic. It's not going to be tied to particular places. and it's going to, be very mobile. And also, I mean, in terms of, again, I mean, because of the economy of scale, these global corporations can deliver products much more cheaply, and that is a potential benefit for the poor. Mm-hmm. Just take an example. I read a recent study that indicates, okay, let's say we went to a protectionist tariff here, a very high tariff.
That's something no one would have imagined the U.S. ever thinking was a good idea until recently.
Particularly the Republican candidate. But anyhow, that's a different story. But it was saying, okay, let's say we slap a 40% tariff on everything. That would probably diminish for middle class people their purchasing power somewhere to 20 to 25%. But for poor people, it would diminish somewhere around 65% because of where they shop. So again, you have to ask the question, who are you really helping and who are you really harming with something like a tariff? And that's where I think we need to do a better job. And particularly in that case, I would say showing the preferential option for the poor is to say let's have free trade.
Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about the free movement of labor and stuff, you start to run against these issues, be it like immigration or intellectual property rights, mm-hmm. And in environmental crisis issues. Like all three of those are issues that our nation state boundaries are ignored, right? Like immigration's an issue that's you have to deal with it as a nation state, but the laws being obeyed around immigration are the markets, not any particular governments. And the environmental crisis, like the poor get affected more than the ones contributing most. And so I'm wondering how you see Christians who are both have an allegiance to Christ and also are citizens of different nation states. How does that preferential option for the poor and being a realist about our global situation,
right.
What does it mean to be a responsible citizen and disciple?
Yeah, well, I need to preface my answer by saying, look, I think we may be in a transition right now from nation state to what Philip Bobbitt calls market state. Mm. And I think it's going to be slow and it's going to be gradual and it's going to be clumsy. But it changes the way a government begins to operate in terms of its relationship with citizens. And to oversimplify, a nation state is primarily, I think, committed to protecting its citizens, whereas the market state is primarily dedicated to providing economic opportunity to its citizens. And those two are not necessarily compatible. Mm-hmm. So that to offer opportunity means we're not going to protect you. You're going to be subjected to risk, and that's the way it is. So with that change in mind, then I think it forces you to think out questions like immigration much differently. That one of the assumptions, and the reason I used the term migration was because I wanted to use a charged word.
Oh, yeah.
We make, I think, a false assumption that everyone that comes here wants to stay here. That may not necessarily be the case. They may want to come, work for 10, 12 years, send the remittances back home, and then relocate after a while. And that's one of the things we want to think through is saying, okay, if people really have something to contribute to the economy, why not let them in for a while? And I see nothing wrong with that, temporary work permits and things like that. Now, of course, I think you've got to vet people so that you don't want people in that want to do other people harm. Mm-hmm. And you also have to make sure that you don't overwhelm the social services by letting too many people in, because that can be a problem. But I think we can have much more liberalized work visa programs, things like that. And I think that's what all countries are going to have to do is begin to think through, because again, if you don't allow the workforce to come in, eventually the jobs will move to them. And then you lose tax revenue and a whole variety of things. And again, I think that's very compatible with Christian notions of being non-territorial. Our identities are not tied up in our national loyalties. I mean, loyalty to Christ trumps, sorry, bad word. Our loyalty to Christ counters all other loyalties. And how do you begin to think through of being associated with people that come from every race and nation? Mm-hmm. And I think that's where I think actually Christians now have a contribution to make to political thought. We're saying, how can we think through associations that are non-territorial?
So when we pray in the Lord's Prayer, give us today our daily bread, and we're praying it with Christians globally every week, not just in our congregation. So how does that type of prayer change the way we might think about something like TTP or these free trade agreements? Because I think I know people on the right and left who, even the way they frame their discussion of that there's some horizon to the give us today our daily bread that's not everybody, at least in the way they frame it and think about it.
Well, I think when you pray that prayer in respect to something like the trade agreements you just mentioned, it is precisely this, that through these agreements, more people will have more bread to eat. And I think that's what the force of the petition is not necessarily to give me and my fellow citizens more bread at the expense of others, but how can you distribute the bread so that everyone has enough to eat? The other way to think about it, I think Karl Barth does a very nice job outlining the love of neighbor. And he talks about, neighbors near and far, distant, and all. And that's how we need to start thinking through how do we exhibit a love of distant neighbors that we will never meet. And I think part of that is through enabling their participation in the markets. Now, it's a very oblique form of love. It's certainly not very intimate. But nonetheless, it is a way of saying, look, through these exchanges, you are at least getting a greater portion of the bread that you need.
And I know a lot of people who will go back and forth around arguing around, say, travel trips within churches or these type of things. But I think situations like that, along with doing a better job at hosting and welcoming people that are migrating here and going other places, we're getting to a time because of travel and just technological advance where we're more aware that some of that otherness we put to people in other parts of the globe, but we're still connected to economically and environmentally, those walls are starting to come down some. And I think that the disintegration of that otherness will actually help the ethical intuitions the church has already been cultivating towards the neighbor expand. Is that?
Oh yeah, I think there's nothing better than to get out and see the world, because, and I'm not saying necessarily to be a tourist, but begin to take the world seriously as a place where we exercise our faith, where we live out our discipleship. And it can be done sometimes just simply by taking a walk. And what I mean by that is where I work, Garrett Evangelical is on the campus of Northwestern University. Mm-hmm. And about 300 yards away is the Kellogg School of Management, which is dedicated to international business management. If you go down there, what you see immediately is something that never occurs in the seminary, and it's people working in teams, usually from about 4 or 5 different continents. And what they have to learn to do is, in order to solve a common problem, they got to learn how to negotiate their differences. And I think it's a wonderful model for how we should be doing theological education being done in a school of management. But what I'm saying is, I don't think you can live in the world today and not encounter difference. And that's, again, the reality of globalization. And I think there's nothing at all incompatible with that with the Christian faith from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. So how would you describe the kind of proper role of the regulations, assertion of rights, and redistribution? Like in the best of all possible worlds, when does the government in any form kind of protect, assert, and use those powers?
I think the government regulations are important to protect consumers primarily from fraud and harm. Okay. So, for example, I think government needs to regulate the way food is packaged and produced to make sure that the safety standards are being met. I'm not sure government needs to tell me what to eat. So mm-hmm. that, so I think, if the government all of a sudden began to require me to eat broccoli, which would be horrible.
Depends on how much cheese is on it.
Yeah, that's right. And what kind of cheese. Then I think that's a regulation that doesn't make much sense to me. Mm-hmm. So it's really, in a sense, saying, okay, what are the kinds of regulations that we need in order to incur certain kinds of goals, and then be very, very blunt about that. And also, it's a way of saying, even in terms of like redistribution, is say something like education. I think that's a shared opportunity cost of an entire society, mm-hmm. because it benefits everyone to have an educated populace who have certain skills, and those opportunity costs need to be shared. But again, the question becomes: is the redistribution best meeting the needs of people by funding schools or funding students. That's just a fundamental difference, and it's something that needs to be debated. Sweden, for example, has decided that their redistribution better meets the needs of their people by funding students rather than schools. So much to the surprise of many people, I think Sweden's entire primary and secondary education system is funded through vouchers. And there's fierce competition between state schools, nonprofit, and for-profit schools. But it's really, in a sense, the citizens and consumers who decide what are their needs again, but using this redistribution to pursue the kind of education. So I think there again, even redistribution, you have to ask the question, what is really empowering and enabling the recipient in whatever redistribution scheme you have?
Well, I mean, even taking that example, I'm interested in how the answer to that question is different if you're not in a society that is as ethically homogenous as Sweden, and one that doesn't have more or less a ginormous social safety net. Because I could imagine in Sweden advocating something like that, because the commitment the government and the nation's already made to every citizen is significantly higher than it is to that we make to ours, and we also have we also don't have the Sweden doesn't have the history of the church kind of being anti-intellectual, anti-science, and wanting to cloister itself because we have so many different religious expressions. But if we did something like that, and then in a town where there's already racial and religious tension, you have a Muslim school, a Catholic school, and 5 different types of Baptists in their own private school, then it could be less ideal in certain parts of our country than other parts. And how does those details get worked out?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I'm not necessarily saying the Swedish model would work here.
No, I knew I knew you weren't. I was just saying, if in one sense you could see a compromise where someone's like, well, we would like to get to this type of opportunity for education, and then you're like, okay, well then let's get to this type of basic support for each citizen or something like that. Right.
And I think, but again, what you could approach is saying, okay, if part of the educational system, and its only part, is to enable people to at least leave with skills that can get them a job, then you really have to ask, what are we doing wrong in a system which, when you come out of high school, you usually aren't prepared to do anything? And the reason being is, I think it's very interesting that it's estimated that of all the new jobs being created over the next 10 to 15 years, only about 40% will require college education. And yet 98% of all high school students are pre-college. So you have to ask, what's wrong with that? And I think you have to again say, okay, if we're going to fund an educational system which is really beneficial to all, we no longer really need to make the assumption that everyone's college bound. Some clearly are not. So, I mean, we need to look at other kinds of models. We're saying, how do you get an educational system which is actually going to give greater benefit to the students? Because what happens then, everyone goes to college, they take out huge loans, and not everyone graduates, and not everyone finds a job because of that. But they start off life with a mortgage. And I'm not sure that's a good system. So we may want to think through that in these globally competitive days. What skills should they have, at least at a minimum, when they graduate from high school?
Is there, I have a lot of teachers in my family, and I think they would kind of respond by going, well, the main job of the public education is not just preparing them for jobs, but to be a citizen in a country that needs a more actively engaged citizenry. But if you ask them about the job stuff, I think people that do the education stuff are more interested in helping that process get along than people that aren't. And I find it odd. Like, my mom is very involved in North Carolina public education, and once we had Republicans in charge of the state, the educators were the least listened to people in a lot of the transitions that happen. And then you get a backlash that then returns to patterns of education that were before that weren't in light of globalization and the changing technology and this type of stuff. So I'm wondering, like, as Christians who both in the church, who we have people that are in every industry and every type of vocation, and also are active citizens, what does it look like for us to speak to people in areas, listen to them and learn, but also to speak to other congregants to be supportive and engaged in different areas? So I think the terms of theological ethics and citizenship in the country has become so partisan. It's like we turned off ears to the very people who spend every day in fourth grade classrooms and to who work with ESL education across the country, because the answers we put as possible have already been narrowed prior to asking people with daily lived experience in those areas.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of things going on there. I mean, I'm not sure that what we would call vocational training is necessarily opposed to good civics education, for lack of a better term, citizenship. You can do both, not either or. Mm-hmm. And I think, it may be that we need to think through how can we do both and do both very well. And it may be that maybe we need to invest more in community colleges where people really don't need a bachelor's degree. What they need is really certified training in a particular trade or a profession. And what I'm saying is I think a variety of models would serve us better so we can begin to learn from a wider variety rather than a one size fits all kind of approach. But the other thing too is that even there, I mentioned earlier the transition from nation state to market state, that things get very confused because you're living now with much more multiple identities, and those are very formative. Mm-hmm. So it may be that my interest as a consumer is actually more important to me than my interest as a citizen. And therefore, what does it mean to be a citizen? I might collapse that and say, well, I don't care about being a good citizen. I want to be a consumer. And those identities, it won't be that stark, but I think that's what we're going to have to start working through, is that the nation state tried to, one of the things it tried to do is exercise a monopoly of identity. And I don't think that's just going to be the case anymore. That we're all going to live with very multiple identities, and we're going to have to find a way of ordering them. Now, there again, I think Christianity has a lot to say about the ordering of these identities. We would call them desires. Mm-hmm. And what is properly ordered desire in terms of the loves that shape us and form us. And we have to, be very, very intentional about how we order those different identities so that we get them in the proper order.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you are thinking of these multiple identities and multiple kind of locations, really, of or attachments to your kind of self-understanding, what does it mean then, or what kind of advice do you give to your students who are going to be kind of stewards of the liturgy, scriptures, texts? Like, what does spiritual formation look like in light of globalization, the changes in technology, in the movement that you're identifying in the book?
Well, that's part of the fun of teaching ethics, because my specialty is I tell my students, my job is to make you wise as serpents. My job's not to make you as innocent as doves. In other words, learn the ways of the world so that you can better serve your people. And that's the part of the curriculum that I teach. And what I mean by that is to say, in my class I often ask, where are you going to see your people? And of course, the big answer is on church on Sunday morning. Yeah, but other than that, we're probably in the hospital. Yeah. Where else? Maybe I'll visit them at home sometime. In asking this question over the last 15 years, only 4 people have ever said, I'm going to visit them where they work. And that's where I think, again, if you really want to understand the people you serve, see where they spend about 60% of their waking hours, the place that they work, and begin to have an understanding of what are the particular pressures that they feel, what are the issues that they deal with. Because I think that will tell you a lot. But the second step of that then is to enable their work as their Christian vocation. That I think too often we think of the church as a voluntary organization, something that most people do part-time. Well, that's ridiculous, because there's no part-time Christians. Okay, we're full-time Christians, and therefore we're all full-time ministers of Jesus Christ. And therefore, how do you exercise that vocation as a banker, as a teacher, as a parent? And how does the church help you to do that? And I think it's paying attention to what's going on in the world and saying, this is, I always, again, kind of get annoyed at the church when they think there's a problem in the world, they form a committee. Well, the church is already in the world. The people are already there. How do you enable them then to bear witness to their faith through their actual actions? And I'm not saying that you should, wear your Christianity on your sleeve. I mean, piety has never been my strength. But I think you do through the way that you interact with people, by the decisions you make, by the ways that or the convictions that you have, what you value, gives a strong indication how you've been formed in the faith. And again, we need, I think, to recover the ministry of the laity.
Mm-hmm. And I know if you are a minister listening, and I know you've been a minister before, one of the things just to even meet people when they're in the work zone, I did was I had a once a month set time where I was going to be at the kind of next to my church closest tap room at drive home time. And if you're able to just talk to congregants between the drive home and when before they get home, they'll let you in on parts of their lives they don't when they've got up, managed to get kids dressed, possibly get to worship or show up for spiritual education or whatever the things are there.
Right.
I was told to do that by a mentor of mine a long time ago. He's like, you need to figure out how you interact with your student minister, students when they're leaving school, right? Like coffee shop after school, and their parents, grandparents when they're coming from the place they invest their energy, because then you'll hear the questions that are really on their heart. I'm like, whatever. It seems like a good reason to put having a beer with friends on my worksheet. So sure, but it's amazing how it ends up shaping the way you think about worship, exegeting text and stuff when you're let into the parts of life that of the people you are called to serve and care for that you wouldn't normally hear.
Well, I think that's right, and and it's also humbling when you're an ordained person to realize how much more good the people you supposedly are serving than you do. And I married into a business family, and I often tell my class, and I know they don't believe me, but it's actually true. I said, I think my father-in-law probably did more good for more people in a week than I will do in a lifetime. And it's because he was loyal to his employees, loyal to his customers, he worked long, hard hours. But again, he provided things that people really needed. And sometimes I'm not so sure if I give anybody really what they need. I mean, I confuse them a lot. But it's really a very interesting kind of question of saying, how can you use something like globalization to recover a sense of secular calling and vocations? I think that's an opportunity we shouldn't lose.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other things I was wondering is how have your friends and peers responded to this book? Like, what have been the most a frequent either well, I had no idea you'd say that, or the biggest pushbacks or responses you've gotten?
Right now, it's mainly just some anecdotes because the book's only been out about a month.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew I was going to lose friends on both the left and the right. So far, what my friends on the left accuse me of is putting too much trust in markets, and my friends on my right telling me I don't put enough trust in them. So that's generally the book has been favorably received by a few Christian economists,
mm-hmm.
And they've been a little more enthusiastic than the theologians about the book. My hunch is, much to my surprise, also given the changing political environment, I find that I guess I'm a radical moderate. So, and I'm looking for that Goldilocks way of regulation, just right. I guess what really prompted me to write the book in retrospect is I think globalization really has been good news for the poor, and I don't want to give up on it. And I think there's problems with it, but I think the problems are fixable. And simply because you have a few problems doesn't mean that the concept's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I realize everything's not going to be, turn out as glowing as many of its champions maintain. But I think all things considered, it would be very bad news for the poor to retreat from capitalism at this or globalization at this moment. And the other thing, the reason, and by the way, it was the marketing people. They always come up with the best titles for the books because my titles never stick because they're boring. But it's what I realized, that if you're going to defend globalization, then you have to defend capitalism. I mean, it's just a package deal right now. And that's what prompted the title of the book, is to come clean and say, yeah, if you're going to promote this, you have to promote the other.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think is the biggest concern you have that when addressing kind of capitalism and its role in globalization? If you were sitting down with your conservative friends who were upset, and then they're just like, oh my goodness, you sound way too much like the people who are doing, and think of all the things progressive people do, they're connected to their piety stuff. Like, what's the main thing you want your more conservative friends to hear?
That there are losers, short-term losers, and you have an obligation to help them get back into the game. You simply just can't say, too bad you lost. And you just have to fess up. Yeah, there are losers in globalization. Sure. I mean, there is a reason why it's called creative destruction. There is destruction. And you have to deal with that. And you are under an obligation to retrain people. You're under an obligation to provide a safety net, because it's through no fault of their own that many times they're victimized by this. And you might as well fess up to that. That doesn't detract from the creative part of the markets. But I think we do have an obligation to help those. I mean, industries have been destroyed. There's no question about that. I mean, it used to be a thriving furniture and garment industry in North Carolina. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's been partly through globalization. I live in Pittsburgh and commute to Evanston. I think there's only one steel mill left in Allegheny County. Again, that's part of the destructive nature of global markets. But we have to realize that, with change, you have to retrain and enable people to find different forms of employment. And in some sense, this is nothing new. I mean, when we started in the 20th century, almost 48% of the American population was engaged in agriculture. By the end of the 20th century, less than 2%. And they produced not only enough food to feed everyone, but to export. I think the same thing's going to happen in manufacturing. And again, we have to start thinking now, what kinds of training are we going to need to give people so that they can find the different kinds of jobs that are going to come about. So I think finding jobs for people is a challenge. The other challenge, I think, is there's unquestionably a gap between rich and poor, and it's growing. Now, in some way, you could argue as long as the floor is going up, you don't need to worry about how high the ceiling gets. But the other problem, I think, is that it may be an unsolvable problem to narrow that gap. And the reason being is that historically, if you look at when the gaps have occurred or grown, it's been during periods of high innovation, because those who have been able to innovate take advantage of the market, grow the wealth, and outpace each other. But after a while, the gap narrows. The problem now is that the innovations come so quickly that we may not have a chance for those gaps to narrow. So we have to really think through, is the gap a bad thing? And if so, how do we address it? And I think that's a debate that hasn't been resolved yet.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you went to Claremont for seminary. I did my PhD in Claremont, but also worked at a church in Palos Verdes with multiple banking executives and executives of Raycon and places. So coming out here, I came out with my good old economic philosophy text marked up, ready to be a good Marxist and go and argue. And then in the situation of being between Claremont, which is a very progressive political invested seminary, and then a congregation that's UCC, but it's also full of people living out lives in a world going, this is very idealistic. I found so I decided at Claremont, because you have to take 2 transdisciplinary classes. I took both of them were econometrics classes in the business school, the Drucker School of Business at Claremont, and they were extremely helpful for me. My natural proclivities is to be so progressive. I feel like it slightly tempered it, but I also realize how different arguments function and can understand them. But I have yet to figure out how to invite more progressively committed Christians who have never taken the time to be realistic about where we are, what the situation is, what the power is. Like, how would you give an invitation to more progressive Christians to take certain facts on the ground or conditions seriously enough to then speak theologically in ways that could matter more? Like, I don't think we can. I think there's a benefit to having theologians who are very committed to justice and stuff like that. It's just so often the assumptions and premises they make, to me, don't acknowledge our present conditions that well, if that makes sense.
It does. Well, it's a cultural problem we have right now. We tend not to listen to people we disagree with. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we tend to only congregate with people that we agree with, even in terms of neighborhoods where people live and that sort of thing. So I think the church needs to help model for society. How do you listen to people with whom you disagree? And again, I think the theological premise of that is that we learn to love people we don't like. It's just part of who we are as Christians. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I would like to see happen is that before we begin to make these rather wholesale blanket condemnations, is to actually spend some time in the environments that we think are wicked and evil, and see what's going on in there. So, for example, at our seminary, I hope someday that some of our interns are placed in corporations where they actually have to see what's it like for life in the corporate world, and begin to learn that people don't always talk about making profit. They talk about a lot of other things, and they talk about enabling other people to do things. And they actually talk about making contributions to the community beyond providing products and things like that. So that at least there's a human face on what's being criticized. I think we also need sometimes to do the homework. Again, Garrett's a very progressive place, and oftentimes encounters students who make these sweeping denunciations and then find out they've never read Adam Smith. They've never read the text that they're taking to task, and say, no, you haven't earned the right to criticize it. You got to know what it is. So do your homework, and then to really think through is saying justice is important, but ethics is bigger than justice. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you got to make the hard questions of saying, what would you prefer? If not this, the what is a decent alternative? And to place guess you, I mean, I'm back there, and if I learn nothing else from the theology of the cross, I've learned you must deal with the thing as it is and not as you would prefer it to be. Mm-hmm. And I don't think the world's ever going to be as anyone prefers it to be. So realistically, what can we do to begin to provide for the material well-being for as many people as possible? And again, what I've experienced in dealing with people in corporations is they were much different than I assumed that they were. I mean, one of the benefits I had in writing this book was that the entire manuscript was read by a CEO of a global corp. And he was very helpful in saying, no, that's not how global corporations think. This is how they do it. And it turned a lot of my thinking on its head because, for example, I thought the first question you asked when you're going to make a direct foreign investment is, how much profit will there be? No, that's the last question. First question is, what's the political stability? Is the rule of law? Are contracts honored? What's the infrastructure? What's the workforce like? And then when you've answered all those questions, then you crunch the numbers and say, would it be profitable? So again, it's just even the way they go about doing business dispelled a lot of my preconceptions. And I think that would go a long way if we could begin to get people into the environments that they're actually criticizing, to go in with an open mind and observe mm-hmm. what's really going on here.
So you finished the book before the election. So mm-hmm. I'm interested in any closing thoughts, how would you restate, re-emphasize, redirect the content of the book, or just the ethical imagination of the church, given our surprisingly now we're draining the swamp, so mm-hmm. I guess so how does that election changed or I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, I guess for the purpose of disclosure, I didn't vote for anyone for president. Okay, so I didn't really have a dog in the fight. But now comes the hard work of saying, okay, we have a president who's made certain kinds of campaign promises that I find alarming. You know, I think a kind of retreat from, if he fulfills those promises, from globalization, which I think would be disastrous for both practical and moral reasons. Practical reasons being the toothpaste is already out of the tube. You can't put it back in, not without a lot of destruction. And morally, not only are you going to harm the poor globally, you're going to harm the poor domestically, the very people you said you wanted to help for a whole variety of reasons. And I think encouraging the new administration to think long and hard about how, who is it that you really want to benefit, and what's the best way, again, to do that. Practically give up your tweeter. I mean, quit tweeting, and really just do the quiet, hard work of thinking through what are the policies that we need in place, and who's going to benefit, who's going to be hurt. But this is not the time to retreat from globalization. I think, again, that would be disastrous on a whole series of fronts. Is to say, look, there's been some poor execution of globalization, but work on the execution. Don't throw the concept out. And I'm hopeful there's some voices that may capture his ear. I mean, at this point, we really don't know what's going to happen. And I mean, I think it was Chesterton that once remarked, what democracy and monarchy hold in common is that it both prove that just about anyone can rule. And I think that we take some consolation in this, that presidents come and go.
Mm-hmm. Well, in thinking about even the conversations that more progressive ethicists have been having, how would you understand the role, distraction, positive or contributions that all the attention different types of identity politics have had in the church? Because a lot, like if you think back to our denomination, like UCC or the Presbyterians, Lutherans, there was a time that their ethical investment had to do with really support structures for working people and much more economic justice type of focus of the denominations. And over time, it's been turned towards different identity politics issues, which I can completely understand. I'm interested in, if we were to take globalization and this trajectory you're describing seriously, where would you advise more of our energy get focused and invested in now as globalization is kind of moving forward?
I think the shift needs to take place of saying, what are the identities that bind us together in that wonderful Augustinian phrase, in our bonds of imperfection? Mm-hmm. And what is it that brings us together? Because increasingly, I think we've emphasized those identities which divide us. And there needs to be, I think, some counterbalance to this. I think the underlying issue, which is much more difficult to address and much more fraught with tension, is it's not entirely clear to me that something like globalism and multiculturalism are compatible. Because I think globalism is committed to providing opportunities for individuals, whereas multiculturalism is dedicated to preserving the identity of groups. Mm-hmm. And we've got to work through, is there a way that you can harmonize the two, or are they actually incompatible on this side? If so, which side are you going to choose on that one? That's a much more difficult one. But I think eventually it has to be addressed, because I'm not entirely certain they are compatible.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely understand that tension, and I think it because I think at the heart of people, even if they don't aren't conscious about it, the battles over recognition from what you deem as the orbiting powers of a culture, lack of recognition is experienced as violence to the self in our kind of age of authenticity and stuff. So the identity politics warriors are really trying to keep people from being harmed in in the way we understand ourselves as groups and stuff. And then, but those conversations are really different than a lot of the class conversations that happen, or how government markets and stuff affect the environment and things, that they really use a different logic. And you wonder, can you use both at the same time and think theologically?
Yeah, I think that's what you got to keep your eye on, is that at least increasingly in the people I meet, their identities are expressed primarily through what I would call chosen options, profession, friends, family, and less by given identities of race, ethnicity, and citizenship. And increasingly, I'm encountering people who see the given identities as impediments to who they really want to be. And that's a sea change. And I think now, I'm not saying that chosen identities are necessarily superior to given identities, but we need to take that into account. That increasingly, I think that's how people prefer to identify themselves, is in a sense how they construct themselves, rather than how they're born into groups.
Mm-hmm. Well, even before we had this problem in the history of the church, there's always been theologians or people reflecting on spiritual life where there's like this kind of naive level of belief, and then where you come to believe again, or come a second naivete, or you're believing again versus believing still, this re-chosen embrace of an identity that you were born into at baptism, but then you come to own again. Right. And it's just, that's been extended to so many different parts of and so many different options, that I think in one sense the self is under siege, and whether or not like culture or markets or things are the places we go to work that out, are those the most hospitable places to figure that out?
Right. Well, I'm assuming it was always insulting to the Roman Empire that Christians claimed that it was their second and not their first birth that was important.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. The book is Just Capitalism, and I hope that enough people are so frustrated they have to go get it, read it, and and if you have to steal it or something because you're really worried about market contributions to its future, it's whatever, man. Pray about it.
Okay. Very good.